Hello, everybody, and welcome to another exciting edition of the Weekly Pitch. I'm Matt Price, coming to you from my house in Rockland County, New York, as we're still under quarantine, as we still undergo the coronavirus or actually, I should say, as we are continuing to suffer through the coronavirus pandemic. But we're not suffering too much because we are still doing what we love to do, which is to have nice sports conversations. And that's exactly what we are going to do tonight. Obviously, there was breaking news that broke out at the end of this past week. It involves the NBA, where they have officially postponed not just the NBA draft lottery, but the NBA draft itself. So what does this mean for the league, and what are the possible plans moving forward? So with that, I would like to welcome in my panel for this week. We have James Murphy, Bryan Hultgren, and one of the best sports minds I know that we all know right now, Mr. Jake Asman, IC graduate of 2017. He is also one of the sports personalities on SB Nation Radio down in Houston, Texas. Jake, how are you?
Guys, thanks so much for having me. It's an Ithaca reunion. Awesome to be with you. Thanks a ton, and I'm looking forward to talking some sports with you guys.
Absolutely. James, Bryan, how are you both doing tonight?
Yeah, I'm doing fantastic. Quarantine life still could be
very
a
well
little
as
bit better, but, making the most of it. We're all doing great.
All right. Well, with that, let's get down to business. NBA draft officially postponed, and that goes for the lottery as well. So, Jake, let's start with you. You are someone who follows an NBA team or followed an NBA team down in the Houston area, the Houston Rockets. You're someone who has covered a lot of basketball over time. In your mind, first of all, what was your reaction when you heard this news, and then what do you think this means for the NBA?
Yeah, I don't think it's that big of a surprise given everything that's happening. I mean, the season has to be played, and by the time they hopefully do resume the season and, either, wrap up the regular season or go right to the playoffs, the draft would have already probably have come and gone the way that this is trending. So, yeah, it makes sense to move it back. And, it's tough to do a draft lottery where you don't have the final standings for the percentages of the amount of ping pong balls you get. So, I don't think it's that big of a deal just because, you look at what's happened with the world right now. Obviously, if the NBA is going to come back, it's probably not going to be till at least end of May, mid-June. I mean, no one really could give you a definitive answer. We sit here, it's May 1st, and clearly we're at least, to me, a month away before we can get anything started. You hear different proposals about Vegas or Disney possibly being an option, but then there's a lot of questions that have to be asked about how readily available testing is and, how, readily available are these players going to want to be to, leave their families and kind of live in a biodome for however long it's going to be. So, there's a ton of questions, but I think moving the draft and the lottery, that was a no-brainer.
Bryan, were you surprised at all by this move that the NBA made?
Absolutely not. I personally thought this move was pretty much going to be a no-brainer after we heard about what was going to happen with the NFL draft and how they moved over to a more of a remote draft. But specifically, I agree with a lot of the points that Jake was making. The fact of the matter is the NBA may be able to come back. There are starting to get some proposals to come in about how the season could resume, how things could play out, where things are going to be played, if fans are even going to be able to attend. And you can't really have a draft or a draft lottery without having the final statistics or even a playoffs without the draft lottery. So, yeah, not really surprised. Pretty much everything agreed with Jake and then some.
So, James, now let me come to you because Bryan made an interesting point just now about how you don't have final stats. Remember, it's not just final stats of NBA teams. You also don't have final stats of certain college players who would have been selected in the NBA draft, now have to wait a little longer. How do you think this will impact the NBA draft overall, especially knowing the fact that a whole lot of factors have been affected by this?
I'm not 100% sure if the college players will be affected quite as much because a lot of the players being drafted would have had their seasons short anyway by means of elimination. But so I don't think it'll be much of an issue. I guess maybe if you're talking about certain one and dones who only have about a year's worth of tape, it could be an issue. But other than that, I don't many teams going to have a problem. But I think they'll just be able to go about it the same way they would every year.
The funny thing about all this is that it feels like there's always a development every single hour of every single day. Right now, we don't know what's going to happen next, especially when it comes to the draft. Jake, let me come back to you, because now that we know that the draft has officially been postponed, and personally, I'm not surprised about that either. It was bound to happen. It was bound to happen. But do you see the NBA draft possibly doing the same thing that the NFL did with its draft, going virtual and all that?
Yeah, I think especially after how successful the NFL was, and there's 7 rounds, and there's way more prospects that get drafted. When you look at the NBA doing it, it's only 2 rounds, and because ESPN have that experience already, they're also the rights holders for the NBA draft. To me, it seems like a no-brainer for them to do that, assuming that things don't get significantly better over the next couple months, and gatherings of a lot of people will be allowed. I mean, even if you could do the draft where the players are there in person, if there's no fans, I don't think it's that exciting. It's not a spectacle unless you get the fans in the building. So, yeah, I think, you make an interesting point that we're probably looking at a virtual NBA draft when it's all settled at some point.
Yeah, and kind of piggyback on that for a second. It's not just from the success factor from the NBA, but it's also going to be the fact that there's still the conversation about the risks that's going to be implemented for a lot of fans if they're even going to be able to come back for this year's draft. And also just the fact that people are starving for sports. I mean, a lot of people are getting sick and tired of watching reruns of classic NBA, NFL, MLB, whatever you want to pick for sports games. They want something. And I think part of the reason why the NFL draft was so successful, even though it was remote, was that it was something new. It was something like your first taste of like excitement with sports back again, even though it was just a draft. And I think the NBA draft is an even bigger, I would say just as much of a bigger deal for ESPN to run. So obviously they're going to try to run and implement this as far as they can go. And they proved they could be successful with the NFL. It makes absolutely no sense why they wouldn't do it for the NBA.
That's a good point. It's a very good point. And look, we can all agree that baseball events are not the same. Sporting events overall, basketball, baseball, whatever, they're not the same without fans. It's not the same. We can all agree on that. Obviously, we remember what happened a few years ago with the White Sox-Orioles game due to protests going on in Baltimore. So for everyone's safety, they decided to just leave the ballpark empty. But, right now we're living in an era where we don't know what's going to happen next. We don't know when seasons are going to resume. We don't know when fans are going to be in the stadiums or arenas, and we don't know how many of the fans will be drawn in at a time until we can get to full capacity. So, James, let me come to you on this. If the NBA were to be one of the leagues that started up again, because right now we don't know when the league's going to start up again. If the league were to start up again sometime either in late May or in the summer at some point, would you possibly see the games being played without fans long term going into the next season as well, depending on when this ends?
Was that
James?
question intended for me?
Yeah, that was for you, James.
Okay, you're breaking up. Could you repeat the question?
Oh, I apologize about that. I apologize. Sorry, we're all dealing with Wi-Fi issues. But the question I had was, when it comes to games that are being played without fans, do you see this as a long-term thing in the coming months, depending on when this ends?
This season, whether people like it or not, that's just probably the only feasible way basketball will come back without it pushing in too much into the 2020-2021 season, which is already having to make some major adjustments as a result of this whole thing. So it's definitely something that will work for this current season, but I don't really think it's going to work for next year, because at that point, the financial losses are going to just outweigh the good that the sake having people not there would bring. You'd have to factor in the financial losses for things like concessions, things like in-stadium, I guess, for lack of a better word, and you might have to compensate for that in other ways. So, I mean, if it has to become a long-term thing for the sake of safety, then I'm sure the NBA will gladly do it. But I think that if you're added over, then the best case scenario for you here is that arenas without fans only goes on for the rest of this season and only this season.
That's a very good point. That's a very, very good point. It's amazing how while we are dealing with the postponement of the draft, you also have to think about a proposal that was made the day before, which was when Adam Silver made the suggestion of asking for 15,000 tests for anyone within all NBA organizations, see if they're positive for COVID-19. But here's the part that really, really surprised me is that those who were asymptomatic could not get tested. Bryan, I'm going to ask you this question. Did you find that a little odd? With all due respect to Adam Silver, who I think has done a great job with the NBA, do you find it odd that even if the NBA moves forward, that Adam Silver would suggest that possibly those who are asymptomatic could not get tested?
I really don't know, if there's a specific answer for that, because there are multiple different reports about COVID-19 testing, not just for the NBA, but for the entire country itself, about how many tests are available, who can get tested, and how this can go around. But I think the NBA should be very careful with players who may be asymptomatic of COVID-19 tests, and really be careful about, who they allow to come to their games, who they're allowing to participate in these events. Because, again, bringing the NBA back in a situation like this, even though could be a slim chance about people getting infected, it's still going to be a massive gamble for their long-term success. Short-term, yeah, you get sports back, there'll be a big sports boom, big deal, big headlines. But saying some of your fans or some of your players start becoming infected with COVID-19, and it really affects their long-term success or their long-term endurance into the NBA. So again, I really don't know if there's a right or wrong answer from Adam Silver's perspective, but that being said, they still need to be really careful and really decide if this is the right decision for them to take.
I want to go back to you, Jake, and pick up where Bryan left off on that point and hear your point of view as someone who's been in the field for the past several years now. Did you find it a little confusing that Commissioner Silver would put up that kind of a proposal? Because when you think about it, basketball itself is a contact sport. So even if you are, let's say you are an asymptomatic carrier, let's say God forbid that someone was on the court playing against the other players or with the other players, then all of a sudden they're asymptomatic carriers, and then that causes it's like a brand new problem. So what's your take on this kind of proposal by Commissioner Silver?
It was kind of tough to hear what you were exactly asking about. But basically, I think when these sports do come back, there's going to be no fans in the stands throughout the remainder of whatever season gets played. And I think when the testing becomes readily available, and I was listening to Scott Boras on a radio show earlier today talk about from the baseball perspective that there are several of these, major market corporations that have tests readily available for Major League Baseball to purchase that would not come at the expense of the general public. So, you could take that and use that with the NBA. If these guys are regularly getting tested and they have access, even if someone were to test positive, you put that person in isolation and you're not going to shut down the whole league again. It was such a new thing to all of us when Rudy Gobert tested positive in March that every league shut down. When these sports come back, it's not going to be, if one person gets it, they shut down the sport again. You can't have that small margin for error there. So eventually, when the sports do come back, I think it's almost a guarantee there'll be no fans in attendance at the start. But the hope is, specifically for a sport like baseball that has a 6-month, season, is as the year moves forward, maybe you can start to have some fans in the stands in some states that will allow it. And maybe by the playoffs, we'll be back to normal in October or normal adjacent that you can have, crowds again. So, where we are right now on May 1st is going to, clearly change, hopefully for the better as we continue to move forward. So the key is readily available testing, and then you go from there.
I want to actually follow up on that. That is a very good argument that you just made. My follow-up is, depending on when the season starts again and whenever any other festivities can start again, if you were someone in high authority, how would you break this up in terms of getting fans back in the stands? Like, how would you do it by small increments if you were you? Like, would it be 10,000 people or maybe like a 5,000 people for from this state to this state? And then if things are still good, bring it up to 10 or 15,000 or anything like that. How would you do that, Jake?
I
Jake.
think. Sorry.
Brian, you want to answer that? Go ahead.
Yeah. Basically, so if I were in charge of any like given league, and thank God I'm not, I think the number one thing you got to ensure, first off and foremost, is player and like faculty safety, like for your personnel and whatnot. That's where you need to start, because that's really going to be like the main attraction, obviously. And you can't really have like a damaged product for the masses to consume, even if it's something from home. People are going to pick up on it and they're going to be turned off by it. Then I say from there, like if I can use an analogy, it's like getting into a hot tub. You start with your toe, then you move down with your foot, then down your leg, and you go slowly and slowly. And it's really, for the most part, just playing it by ear. You get a read of the land of like the virus in your specific area. And it's going to be different state to state. Like New York is going to be a different situation from like Nashville, Tennessee, like just off the top of my head. And New Orleans is going to be different from Boston, and so on and so forth. But I say you start from there. You figure out like the virus like spread in your area. And then once you figure out that, then you can start having the conversation about how many fans do we bring into the stands, and then you slowly start building your way up. Like you start with a small percentage and you work your way up. Like it's going to be a process.
Well, that's how every state's doing it too. Like, so I live here in Houston. Texas today started phase 1 reopening. We're one of the few states, or not few, but obviously compared to California, the Northeast states, they're still you guys living in the tri-state area still have stay-at-home orders until
Right.
May 15th, the earliest. Here in Houston, May 1st, state of Texas, phase 1 reopening, meaning that if restaurants want to reopen, they can, but they're only allowed to open up at 25% capacity. And then 2 weeks from now, there will be 50% capacity. This assumes there's no big outbreak and, the healthcare system doesn't get overrun, which it doesn't seem like that has happened at all down here. It hasn't. It's not like other parts of the country. But the point is, as you were talking about, Brian, there's a slow and gradual process. So you're building up to a point where you hope by, let's say, October, you can have mass gatherings for the baseball playoffs and whatnot. I think the ship has kind of sailed for hockey and basketball to do it with fans, and probably baseball for a lot of its regular season whenever it does start. But you look at the NFL, don't be surprised if the football season is delayed, not because they can't start playing games in September, because I think they can. I think the NFL might decide to delay their season anyway, just so they know that if let's say they start end of September instead of beginning of September, or early October instead of beginning of September, they know that they'll have games with fans in the stands at some point during their season, and a lot of the NFL's revenue comes from the fans. So if you could delay the start of your season because you can get fans later on, I think you'll see leagues do it. I think that's also the case with the NBA and the NHL. If they play deep into the summer, I don't think they really care if they got to start their season in December, if the NBA's got to start on Christmas, because they'll look at it and go, yeah, we're affecting next year if we start late in the summer with the playoffs. But guess what? We're making up a lot of our lost revenue if we start in December, because we need fans in the stands to get the gate revenue. So that's another factor when you kind of look at all this as well.
That is a very good point, Jake. The only counter argument that I personally would make is that right now there are fears of a second wave of this thing. So when you have that in mind, we don't know. Even if the NBA does start up again, who knows if it has to shut down again, just in case, God forbid, this does happen again. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing by then is, when you get the second wave sometime in the fall, by then we should have better testing. We should be better prepared. Hopefully there's a vaccine or there's drugs that you could, implement that could help slow down the virus. The mortality rate of this virus, if you're a young, healthy person, is next to nothing. You have a 98% survival rate. It's the people that have pre-existing conditions. It's the people that have, that are up there in age. Those are the people you have to be concerned about. But sports as a whole, these are the best athletes on the planet. So, I think sports will continue. It's just getting to a point where, fans get back to the stands and like everyday life can resume to what it was. That's going to take some time, but you hope by then, by this second wave, if it does happen, we're way further along with everything that we've been talking about in this podcast.
And the big thing is just piggybacking on that. This is something that can't go on forever. Like eventually you have to start doing this because as Jake was just mentioning, a lot of these sports teams, no, all of them actually, they get their revenue from the fans coming to their games, buying food, getting merchandise, like participating in the events themselves to get more people to come to the next games and so on and so forth. This has to happen at some point. You got to start getting fans back in. And even if there's even a slight risk, it may be one that you have to take, especially if it means investing in the long-term success of your league.
I want to go back to you, James, for a second, because Jake made a very good point, which was actually a point. Thank you very much, Jake, for bringing it up. This was something I was going to bring up.
That's why you guys pay me the big bucks.
Wait, he's getting paid? No one was telling me?
That joke was a slam dunk, let me tell you that. So James.
And Matt just froze. It sounds like mid-laugh or mid-joke. Who knows?
So James, I want to pick up on a point that Jake made. Yeah, I'm right here.
Seems like we lost him.
No, yeah, I'm right here.
Okay,
I'm right here. I'm right here.
Very curious to see what this looks like when I watch it back after it's posted, because Matt, every other word is just like I'm taking a guess on what I think he's saying. So I could have been answering questions that have nothing to do with whatever he was asking, but I'm just taking a guess here.
I blame my Wi-Fi router, and this is something I'm going to have to give a technical foul to.
I guess we'll never know what he's going to have to do.
When the show is over.
That's going to be the cliffhanger for next week's episode.
Anyway, so James, if you can hear me and understand me, a point that Jake made that I was going to bring up, and I'm glad Jake brought it up, was depending on when the NBA season gets back up and running, and depending on when the draft is and all that, we don't know when next season is going to start. We don't know if it's going to start on time or if it could possibly be moved back to either November or December. So my question is, if this were to happen, if the next season were to be pushed up, the start date was going to be pushed up, do you see that happening for future seasons, even when there's no more virus?
Now, I think Bryan and Jake, as well as Matt, are very familiar with a very good friend of IC Radio whose name's Charlie Novak. Very knowledgeable when it comes to the NBA. And he brought up a very good, interesting idea that the NBA season should start on Christmas Day and conclude sometime in July or August. And there's a lot of good points to it. I'll explain. For one thing, the best ratings come on Christmas Day for the NBA. Every league has that holiday where it's all about that sport. For the NFL, it's Thanksgiving. For baseball, it's Memorial Day and the 4th of July. For NHL, you guys can correct me on this, I think it's New Year's.
Yes, it is.
College football even has New Year's Day as well. So, by the way, each and every sport has that holiday that they're associated with, and in a way where they get a lot of views. And that's especially the case with the NBA. Now think about if you're the NBA, if you're able to start the season on Christmas Day, not only that, but you'd also be able to avoid what happens in the October-November months when, in the October-November months when you're basically, in terms of ratings, you're just forfeiting the first 2 months of your season to the NFL because you know they're going to dominate the headlines the entire time. Whereas if you start in December, then there will be more NBA season to look forward to by the time the NFL is done. So there's definitely a lot of upside to having the NBA start on Christmas. It's just a matter of how Adam Silver sees it.
Yeah, and also just another piggyback moment. College football, bowl season's pretty much going to be wrapping up right around that time. NFL is going to be getting ready for the playoffs, and a lot of those games, just on prediction, could be basically start being around like tanking time or garbage time when they really don't mean anything anymore. Having the NBA come in right around that time, like just brings in a whole new headline, a brand new excitement for a new sport to come in, and I think can really do wonders if they play it right. But yeah, I think it's a pretty good idea too.
Jake Asman, do you believe that if the NBA season for next year were to start in around Christmas time, do you see a possibility also of maybe the NBA having a shortened season next year so that way both seasons don't get crammed again?
Well, I think the NBA could just do a full season and just start it, in December. I mean, they're not competing against anything in the summer, and I've long argued, just like I guess Charlie Novak has pointed out, the NBA season should start on Christmas. The reality is the NBA is competing against the NFL and college football the first 3 months of its year. There's no reason to do that. If you're the NBA, start on Christmas. That's when people really, if you're a casual fan, start paying attention anyway. And you could play into the summer, and I think it just makes total sense. You're not competing with anything over the summer. You just have regular season baseball on. The NFL is going to remain kings for as long as they're around. I mean, football is by far and away the most popular sport. You're going to be watching a marquee NBA game on a Thursday night on TNT when there's, Bucks taking on the Saints on Thursday Night Football? The answer is no. You're going to watch the NFL. You're going to watch Tom Brady. You're going to watch Drew Brees over LeBron or anyone else. That's just very smart to start on Christmas. I think it would help the sport long term.
I agree with that. But I want to also make a counter argument. And Bryan, you could follow up with me here. Is that if the NBA were to start around Christmas, which I agree with Charlie on that, I think that'd be a very, very good idea. When you think about it, the NBA season does usually end during the summer. It ends usually in June with the NBA finals, and then they have the 2 to 3 month off season before they begin again in October. Is it possible, Bryan, that they can fit 82 games and the playoffs from December to, let's say, July or August, and then pick up next season in like October or November? Do you see that happening? If this were to happen?
I think it is slightly possible. Like, I think there's obviously going to be like some adjustments made to the overall schedule, like how the NFL just did. The NFL just added an extra playoff team and an extra game of football to their upcoming season. So I think we don't need to go the exact amount of like 82 games, if I'm not mistaken, of the NBA season. I think you can make a slight adjustment, make it a little less if necessary. Like, talk with the Players Association, figure out like what game would be appropriate for them, and would allow not just the players to get ready, but also the NBA itself to get ready. Because as we were talking at the beginning of the show, they're going to have the lottery. They're going to have the NFL draft. They're going to have the player combine. They're going to have a lot of things that they're going to have to cram in as well on top of player rest. So I think if they did decide to do the Christmas route and go like into June, July, August, around that time, I think there's definitely going to have to be some adjustments made. And I think, personally speaking, I think the NBA is in relatively good terms with one another, and as well as their player association. And I think I'm very confident in saying that I think they could definitely make something out. It's not as like tense or as like volatile, for lack of a better term, as like the NFL or the NFL Players Association are.
I'll tell you what, and if you all want to chip in real quick, you are all more than welcome. I don't know which year is going to be more stressful, the rest of this year or 2021. And I'm not speaking just for the NBA. I'm speaking in regards to possibly the NHL, if they were to start when Gary Bettman wants it to start, or if the NFL were to start on time, or even the MLB with the situation they're in, because right now we're already in May and we don't know what's going to happen in that sport. So if any of you want to chip in, go at it. Go right ahead. I'm going to ask this question. Which is going to be stressful? Is it just 2020, or is 2021 going to be more stressful, or do you think it might be a little bit of both combined?
Could you repeat the question? You broke off for a second.
Sure. I was just saying, what do you think could be the more stressful year? Could it be 2020, the year we're in right now, or could it be 2021 in regards to the NBA as well as any other sports who are just trying to get their leagues back on track and also start getting ready to focus on next year?
I think, personally speaking, I think the more stressful year is probably going to be this one, because this is brand new to us and we don't know, like, in this moment, how we're going to react and adjust to the situations that all these leagues have been giving. I think the main problem is just making a plan, sticking to it, and hopefully filling it out to fruition. I think once these leagues get an idea of what they want to do and how they're going to implement it, I think it's not going to make things like easy in the next coming months, but it sure will make things easier and more, and help facilitate like these leagues coming back to where they were before this whole pandemic broke out.
That's a very good point. All right. Well, we are just about out of time. I want to thank James, Bryan, and our guest panelist, Jake Asman from SB Nation Radio in Houston. Jake, we hope that you are doing well down there, and we hope you're staying safe. Hope you stay well. You're always welcome to come back on the show. Bryan, James, as always, good to have you on. And for all of you tuning in, this is Matt Price saying so long, and we will see you next week.